Each of you has in hand a copy of the court's instructions to the jury. Please feel free to follow along as I read the instructions to you. You'll notice that the last page that you have is a copy of a verdict form. Any verdict that you return will be not entered on those copies, but entered only on the original verdict form, which will be with you in the jury room. The copies you have are simply there for your reference. The Superior Court of Washington in and for Grant County, State of Washington Plaintiff versus David Emerson Nichols Defendant, cause number 10-1-322-6, Court's instructions to the jury. Instruction number 1, your responsibilities generally. As jurors, you are officers of this court. You have the following general duties and responsibilities. 1, you must decide which facts have or have not been proved based on the testimony of witnesses and any exhibits admitted into evidence. 2, you must apply the law according to these instructions, whether or not you agree with them. 3, in deciding whether any proposition has been proved, you must consider all pertinent evidence without regard to which party introduced it. 4, you must consult with one another and deliberate with a view to reaching a verdict. After an impartial consideration of the evidence with the other jurors, each of you must decide the case for yourself. 5, in carrying out these duties, you must act impartially with a genuine desire to determine a proper verdict. You also have a duty not to consider certain things as follows. 1, do not be influenced by sympathy for or prejudice against any person. 2, a charge is only an accusation. The filing of a charge is not evidence that the charge is true. Your decisions as jurors must be made solely upon the evidence presented during these proceedings. 3, what the lawyers say is not evidence. Disregard any statement or argument that is not supported by the evidence as you see it or by these instructions on the law. 4, do not presume anything because of objections made by the lawyers or because of my rulings on those objections. If any evidence was admitted but later stricken, disregard it. 5, disregard any indication I have inadvertently made, whether by words or conduct, of my opinion on the believability of evidence or the proper weight to be given to it. 6, you have nothing to do with punishment. The fact that punishment may follow conviction cannot be considered by you except insofar as it may tend to make you careful in your deliberation. 7, the defendant is not required to testify. You may not use the fact that the defendant has not testified to infer guilt or to prejudice the defendant in any way. During your deliberations, it is appropriate to re-examine your own views and to change your opinion if you become convinced that it's wrong. However, you should not surrender your honest belief about the value or significance of the evidence solely because your fellow jurors disagree or for the mere purpose of reaching a verdict. The sequence of these instructions is not significant. The lawyers may emphasize particular instructions, but you should consider them as a whole. Instruction number 2, witnesses and exhibits. Generally, witnesses are fact witnesses, opinion witnesses, or both. Fact witnesses testify to what they saw, heard, or otherwise observed, while opinion witnesses express opinions in addition to their observations. Opinion witnesses are usually people who are qualified to give their opinions by experience, training, or education in a particular field. In some circumstances, lay witnesses may also be allowed to express opinions. Witness testimony and exhibits may be direct evidence or circumstantial evidence. Direct evidence is intended to prove the occurrence of the very things observed by the witness or depicted by the exhibit. Circumstantial evidence is intended to prove not only what the witness observed or the exhibit depicts, but also other facts, which you can infer from those things using only common sense and experience. The law does not require you to give direct evidence more weight than circumstantial evidence. Neither is necessarily more valuable or believable than the other. Jurors are not required to believe any witness, nor are you bound by the opinions given by a witness. You alone must evaluate the testimony of witnesses, considering any factors that you feel have a bearing on the witness's credibility or the weight to be given the testimony. For example, you may consider the opportunity of the witness to observe or to know the things he or she testifies about, the ability of the witness to observe accurately, the quality of a witness's memory while testifying, the manner of the witness while testifying, any personal interest the witness may have in the outcome of the issues, any bias or prejudice the witness may have shown, the reasonableness of the witness's statements in light of all the other evidence, and any other factors that affect your evaluation or belief of a witness, or your evaluation of his or her testimony. When weighing opinion evidence, you may also consider the education, training, experience, knowledge, and ability of the witness, and the sources and quality of his or her information. Instruction number 3, charge and the burden of proof. The defendant is charged with murder in the first degree. The defendant is presumed to be innocent. This presumption requires a verdict of not guilty unless you find, during your deliberations, that the presumption has been overcome by the evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. Every crime consists of several parts, called elements. The defendant's plea of not guilty puts in issue, to be decided by the jury, each element of the crime charged. The state is the plaintiff and has the burden of proving each of these elements beyond a reasonable doubt. The defendant has no burden of proving that a reasonable doubt exists. A reasonable doubt is one for which a reason exists, arising from the evidence or lack of evidence. It is such a doubt as a reasonable person would have after fully, fairly, and carefully considering all of the evidence. If, from such a consideration, you have an abiding belief in the truth of the charge, then you are satisfied beyond a reasonable doubt. Instruction number 4, murder in the first degree, premeditated. To convict the defendant of murder in the first degree as charged, the state must prove each of the following elements of the crime beyond a reasonable doubt. 1, that on or about December 29, 2009, the defendant acted with intent to cause the death of Sage J. Munro. 2, that the intent to cause the death was premeditated. 3, that Sage J. Munro died as a result of the defendant's acts. And 4, that any of these acts occurred in the state of Washington. If you find from the evidence that each of these elements has been proved beyond a reasonable doubt, then you should return a verdict of guilty. On the other hand, if, after weighing all of the evidence, you have a reasonable doubt as to any one of these elements, then you should return a verdict of not guilty. Instruction number 5, definition of terms. Intent. A person acts with intent or intentionally when acting with the objective or purpose to accomplish a result that constitutes a crime. Premeditated. Premeditated means thought over beforehand. When a person, after any deliberation, forms an intent to take human life, the killing may follow immediately after the formation of the settled purpose, and it will still be premeditated. Premeditation must involve more than a moment in point of time. The law requires some time, however long or short, in which a design to kill is deliberately formed. Instruction number 6, evidence admitted for a limited purpose. Certain evidence has been admitted in this case for a limited purpose. This means that you must consider the evidence, this means that you may consider the evidence for one purpose, but may not consider it for any other purpose. Evidence admitted for a limited purpose consists of evidence that any witness made a prior statement that was inconsistent with the witness's trial testimony. If you find that a witness made a prior inconsistent statement, you may consider that circumstance, along with all other evidence in the case, in deciding what weight or credibility to give to any of the testimony of that witness. You may not consider such a prior inconsistent statement to be any proof or evidence of a fact or circumstance alleged in the prior statement. Any discussion of the evidence during your deliberations must be consistent with this instruction. Instruction number 7, deliberations and verdict. Upon retiring to the jury room for your deliberations, first, select a presiding juror. It is his or her duty to see that discussion is sensible and orderly, that the issues submitted for your decision are fully and fairly discussed, and that every juror has a chance to participate and be heard upon each question before the jury. You will not be provided with a copy of the testimony. You may request that portions of testimony be read back to you, but that request can be granted only in very limited circumstances and is most often denied. You will be furnished with the exhibits admitted in evidence, these instructions, and a verdict form. Use the verdict form to record any verdict you reach. In this criminal case, all 12 jurors must agree in order to return a verdict. If you unanimously agree on a verdict, fill in the blank provided on the verdict form with the words "not guilty" or the word "guilty" to express your decision. When you have completed the verdict form, the presiding juror will sign it and will notify the bailiff, who will conduct you into court to declare your verdict.
May it please the court, counsel, and members of the jury. There was one and only one person waiting for Sage Munro outside his house on the morning of December 29th, 2009. One and only one person who had the motive, the means, and the opportunity to kill Sage Munro. One and only one person whose jealousy and obsession for Marita Messick, who was now with Sage, would drive him to go all the way from Montana to Ephrata and kill the girl who would no longer be with him. That person is in the courtroom today. It's the defendant, David Nichols. The defendant's jealousy and obsession for Marita Messick led him to wait outside of Sage Munro's house.
Counsel, would you pause for a moment, please? For the record, you've caused an item to be displayed. Is that something that was admitted in evidence?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay. Thank you. Go ahead.
The defendant's jealousy and obsession for Marita Messick caused him to wait outside in the early morning in the pitch black. And the attack, as the defendant described it in his own words, came in a way that Sage didn't even see it coming. After accomplishing what the defendant had planned and prepared to do, he immediately left Washington, went to Colorado, and after the coast appeared clear, went to a bar in Helena and was pretty proud of himself. He celebrated. He bragged. He was drinking shots of Washington apples, talking about Marita, and telling Eric Alsager about how he had shot and killed Marita's boyfriend. Ladies and gentlemen, the defendant is in the courtroom today because he is the only one with the motive, means, and opportunity to commit this murder. All of the evidence, all of the real substantiated evidence points clearly and unequivocally to David Nichols as the man who murdered Sage. He has been charged with murder in the first degree, and he is guilty. Now we have a lot of evidence to cover. It actually probably seems like it's been some time since we talked about David Nichols in this case. We have to go all the way back to some of our first witnesses to remember events of the scene, and also to consider the specific different pieces of evidence linking David Nichols to it. But where this story really begins is with Marita Messick. She told you how she met the defendant at a party in Helena when she was 15. The defendant was 23. The defendant got her phone number, he called her, and just after she turned 16, they started dating. Right off the bat, it became apparent that the defendant was obsessive over Marita Messick. You heard testimony that he would constantly call her and text her when she wouldn't respond to his calls or texts. He would even call her mother, who testified that she never in a single time during the 2 years that they were initially together ever had a conversation with the defendant face to face. He would call and text Marita Messick's mother to find out where she was and why she wasn't responding. You heard that he would show up on occasion in the middle of the night at the window to find out why. Eventually, after 2 years of dating, Messick called it off with the defendant, and he didn't handle it well. You'll recall the testimony that he continued to call and text her to try to convince her to get back together with him, that he showed up at her work, and eventually, Messick relented. Although they technically weren't together, just the two of them, they continued to talk, they continued to text, they continued to meet, and they continued to have a sexual relationship. But when things started to change was when Marita Messick started dating Zev Barber. You'll recall that Zev Barber lived with his parents approximately 3 hours away from Helena. Mr. Barber started dating Messick, and Messick tried to keep it a secret from him. The defendant found out by searching through Messick's phone, and he called Barber. You heard Barber say that he took the phone call as a threat. The defendant said, "Marita Messick is with me. You stay away from her." And added for good measure, "We just had sex." But that didn't deter Mr. Barber. So what did the defendant do? He somehow found out where Zev Barber lived, 3 hours away, got a picture of the house on his phone, and showed it to Marita. and said, if you don't keep seeing me, I will burn his house down with him and his parents inside. So Messick stopped dating Zeb Barber. And the defendant a short time later let her know, I will hurt the people you love and ruin your life if you don't keep seeing me. So she did. She testified that she continued to talk, text, tell him she loved him, tell him she missed him, continued to have a sexual relationship with him because she knew she needed to keep the defendant happy because he told her what would happen if she didn't. But things started to change again in the summer of 2009. Rita Messick moved with her mother to Ephrata, where she was reunited with Sage Munro, who she had known as a family friend since she was much younger. When her and Sage started dating, shortly after, she returned to Montana to visit her brother. And you'll recall that one night, when she's visiting her brother in Montana around midnight, she's on the phone with Sage when the defendant unexpectedly, unannounced, without warning, comes into the home, comes into her room, and takes the phone out of her hand. Who are you talking to? He looks at the phone and sees a picture that Rita Messick has installed on her phone of Sage Munro with his shirt off. He takes the phone and leaves. She chases after him. He gets in his car, drives down the street, and calls Sage. When Rita Messick catches up, he takes the phone, hangs it up, throws it at her, and leaves before the police arrive. Over the next few months, as Rita Messick and Sage Munro are dating in Ephrata, the defendant's obsession and jealousy are obvious and ever present. You'll remember Nancy Ellison, Rita Messick's mother's testimony, that on at least 2 occasions, the defendant called her in Ephrata, and the phone calls would come on a blocked number between midnight and 3 in the morning, and he would tell her what her daughter was doing with Sage. Now, even though, again, Nancy Ellison had never talked to him face to face, and even though it was a blocked number, she recognized the voice from all those calls back in Montana. What was even more concerning? The call in November. Approximately 30 days before the defendant murdered Sage Munro, he called Rita Messick and asked her what she had been doing. You'll remember that she had been at Sage's house in the front room, sitting with him on some bar stools. When the defendant asked what she had been doing, she told him she had been in Wenatchee, where they had moved by that time. The defendant said, no, you weren't. You were at Sage's house, on the bar stools, with him in the living room. You've heard testimony how it was easy to see into Sage Munro's house, especially at night, because he didn't have any blinds, only sheer curtains that were usually open, and you could see right inside. It was referred to as a fishbowl, and the evidence shows that the defendant knew where Sage lived and was watching him. Now, Ms. Messick also testified that on multiple occasions, all the time, the defendant was constantly asking, are you with Sage? These are just a few of the examples. They're kind of hard to see up on the board, so I might just read them to you. But these text messages here are ones that the defendant kept on his phone. These are text messages actually from Marita. We don't have the defendant's text messages that he sent. These are ones that were kept on his phone when his phone was searched well after the murder. And you can see on 3 of these when she's responding. The top one is one in August, for example. I'm not with him, haven't talked to him all day. The second one in September. I tried calling you, your phone doesn't work. I'm not with Sage, exclamation mark. 96 on the bottom, that's also in mid-September. I can't go, I tried really hard, but I'll keep trying. I'm nagging my mom like crazy, and no, not with Sage. He was constantly paranoid and obsessive and upset that she was spending her time with Sage Munro. Now, during the summer months, all the way up until Rita Messick went to Montana at the end of December and made it perfectly clear that she no longer wanted to be with the defendant, he continued to pursue a physical relationship with Rita Messick. And that was the one thing that was different. When she was with Zeb Barber, she continued that relationship with the defendant. But from the time she started dating Sage, she would no longer do that with the defendant. She made it clear that she wouldn't, and he kept pursuing it. You heard the defense ask Marita Messick on the stand, well, you never really called it off with the defendant, did you? You never really ended the relationship. You remember her response on multiple occasions. I tried. And the defendant knew she was trying. Things began to escalate in November and December. We've already talked about the phone call where he was clearly there watching them at the house. And then, of course, later, around Thanksgiving time, the defendant paid a visit to his friend Rex Lane. Rex Lane had just served a 17-year manslaughter conviction that had been reduced from a murder charge. When he had been released, only within a couple of weeks, he and the defendant met in a bar. And this meeting happened about the same time that Marita Messick moved to Ephrata and started dating Sage. You heard from Mr. Lane that on regular occasions, the defendant would ask him questions about the murder, including what it felt like to kill someone. Well, around Thanksgiving, within about 30 days of when the defendant killed Sage Munro, he asked Mr. Lane again what it felt like to kill somebody. And Mr. Lane told you he didn't want to talk about it. And then the defendant asked the question. He asked Mr. Lane if he would kill someone for him. Asked him 30 days before the murder, around the same time period he is over in Ephrata watching Sage and Marita, if he would kill someone for him. Now, as Mr. Lane told you, he didn't want to talk about it anymore. So no, we don't have any details specifically about who the person was who he wanted to have killed. Mr. Lane testified that after being in the system essentially his entire life, he wanted nothing to do with this type of talk. He told you on the stand that initially the reason why he didn't mention this part to police was he didn't want to be involved. He wanted nothing to do with this trial or this case. But once he realized he had no choice, once he realized he had to take the stand, he told you what the defendant said to him. Now, after this trip, only a couple weeks later, the defendant makes one last serious effort to get Marita Messick back. He takes an unannounced trip to Spokane. The reason why we say unannounced is because it seems from earlier trips when he would show up in Ephrata or Moses Lake, we only know of about a couple of those, that he would call Marita and let her know that he was there or that he was coming, such as when they met in Ritzville. You may remember that story, that they met briefly in Ritzville. He called her and asked to meet him there. She drove Sage's Jeep, and when he got in the Jeep, he started searching the glove compartment, found Sage Munro's name and became furious at her when he realized that it was Sage's Jeep. Well, 2 weeks after he made the proposition to Mr. Lane, he called from Spokane and asked Marita Messick to meet him there. And Marita Messick's response was, these type of meetings have to stop. And so the defendant lied to her. He made her essentially a promise. If you come and see me this one last time, I will leave you alone. The defendant knew what Marita Messick wanted. He knew she was trying to end a relationship. And if she would just come see him this one last time, that would be it. So she went. She showed up, and the first thing that shocked her was that he had rented a hotel room. She called it the nicest hotel room she'd ever seen. Essentially a honeymoon suite, complete with a jacuzzi hot tub and one king-size bed. He then took her out, and they went shopping. During that day, occasionally she would text Sage, and when she did, he would become upset. She was with him right then. Don't be texting Sage. And he went and spent over $1,000 on her. Bought clothes, bought jewelry, and she told him, or asked him, why are you buying me all of this? You know I'm just going to be wearing it with Sage. And he didn't really have a response. It became apparent once they got back to the hotel and the defendant stacked approximately $10,000 in $100 bills on the bed. Marita Messick had never seen so much cash, and she took a picture of it with a blue flip phone that the defendant had just bought her. That's why we have this picture. And then came the proposal from the defendant. Be with me. We can go to Las Vegas or anywhere you want to go. Think of all the money and the gifts. Her response after that proposal, after all the defendant had just done to try and win her one more time, was to tell him, I don't want your money. I'd rather be with Sage with nothing than have all your money and go anywhere. The defendant acted like he didn't care. But then that night, of course, he tried to sleep with her again. And once again, she turned him down. So what happened after this? The next day, they traveled to Moses Lake. And even though the defendant had rented the room back in Spokane, when he got to Moses Lake, he asked Marie Domesic to rent him the hotel room in Spokane in her name, using her ID. She didn't stay with him, she left him there, and she went to Ephrata to be with Sage. We don't know what the defendant was doing that day. The only information that we heard presented was from someone from Bargaintown in Moses Lake, which is one of the bigger scrap places in Moses Lake in Grant County, who testified that the defendant had been there once. Originally, she said she wasn't sure if it was the spring or the fall, but then as the testimony went on, she was sure it was the fall. But even then, it was sometime around September or October, one time, clearly not in December. As we heard from Chief Deputy Rechtenwald, there are laws in the state of Washington which require that any type of those transactions for scrap metal or for car dealerships will have a record of the people in the business they did there. Regardless, the next day, Marie Domesic goes to Wenatchee, and the defendant goes too. And once again, he asks her to get him a hotel room. Now, what's interesting, and we'll talk about this later, is when the defendant related this trip he took to Spokane, he left out Moses Lake. He didn't tell them about staying the night in Moses Lake and about having Marie Domesic rent him a room there. Now, the next trip Messick took was only a couple days after the defendant left Wenatchee. She went to Montana. We heard that on a couple occasions the defendant tried to meet up with her there, and near the end of the trip he tried to kiss her, and she wouldn't even let him do that. She turned her head away. On the 23rd of December, she left without saying goodbye. And as you heard, he was furious, demanded to know why she left without saying goodbye. There are a number of text message records that have been admitted, which don't contain the content of the text, simply that they were made in the time. And you can see these multiple text messages sent from Marie Domesic to the defendant on December 23rd, around the time that she left. This is only 6 days before the murder, less than 6, because it actually happened in the evening. And she leaves without saying goodbye. Now, as you've heard, the defendant had a Yahoo account. I don't remember if you actually got to see this document or not. It's kind of hard to read, so I'll point it out. It shows the defendant's email address, carcrazy07, and that's a Yahoo account. And it shows that when he signed up for it, instead of using his real name, David Nichols, he decided to use the name David Messick. And he used this account to do his email, as you've heard, and also on Craigslist. Now again, Craigslist is more or less an online wanted page for items you want to buy or sell. And when you use Craigslist, you don't have to use your name. You can use an anonymized email address and a phone number. The defendant had used his Yahoo account in the past, in fact, even earlier in December, requesting catalytic converters. But on the same day that Marie Domesic sent him this text at 8:28:17 GMT, and I'll actually admit I'm not actually positive if GMT stands for General Mountain Time or Greenwich Mountain Time, I'm actually not sure, but 18:28 that evening, when she was responding to him and she has to tell you, I do love you, stop it. Because he's accusing her, you don't love me, you left without saying goodbye. No, I do love you. Even though it was clear at this point, it was not the romantic relationship type of love. Within 2 hours of that text message, the defendant posts, using his email and his phone number, wanted .22 caliber pistol. Within 2 hours, and within 5 days of the murder. Within 5 days of the time that he leaves From Helena to Washington, he is looking for a gun. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the defense will try and point out that he's looking for a .22 pistol and that Mr. Munro was shot with a .45. Ladies and gentlemen, we have no idea. We do not have the murder weapon, how he ended up getting his gun. But what we know without a doubt is he was looking for one. Only days before the murder happened, and immediately after Marita Messick left without saying goodbye to be with Sage. And as you heard, that's where she was from the 23rd to the 28th, the day that he left Helena to go to Washington. She was with Sage. And where was the defendant? On Samantha Costigan's couch, while Samantha Costigan was having to work afternoons through evenings. So, December 28th comes around. Marita Messick leaves Sage's house, and you heard that right as she's leaving, she actually calls the defendant, or texted him, I can't remember what she said, but he didn't want to talk. He said he was in a bad mood, was mad about something, and didn't want to talk. He would call her later. But he never called her again that day. When she leaves, within a couple of hours, he leaves. Now, before he leaves or after he leaves, Samantha Costigan contacts him and says, "Where did you go?" And he says, "I'm going to Great Falls. Do you want to come?" Sounds like a potentially interesting or possible alibi. And why would he ask Samantha Costigan to come if he's going to go murder Sage Munro? Well, it's because he knew she worked every night. She told you she worked starting between, I believe it was 12 or 2, all the way through the evening. There was no way that she could go to Great Falls with him. And he wasn't going to Great Falls. As you can see on the map, it's hard to tell that up here is where Great Falls is. Helena is down here. He never went before or after the murder anywhere near Great Falls. And that night, he drove in a distinctly western direction down I-90, and somewhere as he's approaching Washington, Samantha Costigan contacts him again, and he says, "I'm staying the night in Great Falls, and my phone's about to die." And she texts him and says, "In Great Falls, you suck." The last call to ping off his phone, in or out, is just after he's crossing in to Washington State. And then there's nothing. Now, you all know what happened next. On the morning of December 29, 2009, at 6:30 a.m., David Nichols shot Sage Munro as Sage was leaving for his morning workout, just like he did every single morning. Just prior to the murder, Colleen Gibbons was across the street, and she told you that she could see Sage's light on and Sage moving around inside. The defendant would have seen the exact same thing. He knew he was coming out. When Sage Munro came out of his house, somewhere between the back of the truck and the pathway, David Nichols shot him in the chest. The bullet entered through his left chest, pierced his left lung, his heart, his right lung, and exited out his back. Colleen Gibbons saw Mr. Munro hunched over, grabbing his chest, running up the pathway into his house, and when he didn't emerge for a few minutes, she walked over to check on him. She knocked on the door, he didn't answer, so she came back and called his cell phone, and when he didn't respond, then she called 911. The call was made at 6:41 a.m., and by then the defendant was well on his way. Now, something we'll talk about a little bit more later or is what is found in the yard. We know that the handcuffs were found over on the side of the house. What's interesting about the handcuffs location, aside from them being on top of any snow, when you look at the picture, you'll see there's no snow on top of the handcuffs at all, is Colleen Gibbons' view. This is the view, of course this was taken after, so you don't see the truck or the snow in the photograph, but this is the view that was taken from her table where she ate that morning. And as you can see, the truck that had been parked in front would have clearly been in her view. The tree, however, and the car on the side would not have been. You'll remember from the pictures, and there's actually not one on the slide, but you can see them admitted, that there was essentially no snow in or around the tree, and only thin, patchy snow over by the white car, where officers have testified they saw at least 1 or 2 footprints over by those handcuffs. Law enforcement also found on the other side of the house door 1 set of footprints going back into the alley before disappearing. Now, when officers first arrived at the scene, Colleen Gibbons was outside and Harmony Smith had just arrived. Found out and saw that something had happened to her brother. She started contacting her family. She had to tell them that Sage, their Sage, had died. He was gone. She tried to call Marita Messick, but Messick, of course, was asleep and didn't answer the phone. And so she called her mother. When she called her mother, when I say her mother, I actually mean Marita Messick's mother. When she called Marita's mother woke her up and told her the news that Sage was dead. The first thing that Marita Messick did when she composed herself, when Nancy Ellison, her mother, got in the shower to prepare to go to Ephrata, was to call David Nichols. Where are you? Why? Tell me where you are. I'm in Great Falls. That was the first call to ping off of his cell phone at 8:51 a.m. on December 29th, approximately 2 hours and 20 minutes after the murder. He's a little over 2 hours away from Ephrata in the Spokane area, right on the border, more or less, of Washington and Idaho. Now, that wasn't the only call that he got that morning where he lied about his whereabouts. Samantha Costigan also called him. And you'll remember at first he didn't answer, and then he called and was not acting normal. I believe was her exact words or close to them. And he told her that Marita had called and said her boyfriend had been shot. And she says, well, where are you? Samantha Costigan does. Again, I'm in Great Falls. Well then, wouldn't you have an alibi?
Objection, burden shifting, inappropriate argument, comment on Fifth Amendment.
Are you purporting to quote the witness's testimony?
That's right.
Okay. The objection is noted and overruled.
She asked him, wouldn't you have an alibi? He said, yes, there was a friend that I stayed with. The rest of that day, the defendant went, now this is the very next day after the murder, he's leaving and driving east and south all the way down to southern Idaho. The last call on his phone that night pings off around 10 o'clock. And then he continues driving the next day all the way to Colorado, where he stays until after New Year's. Now, after scouring the neighborhood, the police spend a couple of weeks gathering as much information as they can. And then they go on the 12th of January, 2010, 2 weeks, only 2 weeks after the murder. 2 weeks after the defendant gets this phone call from Rita Messick, essentially accusing him of shooting her boyfriend. And they meet with him in front of Samantha Costigan's house. He chooses to have the meeting inside the car, the detective's car out front. Now, what's interesting is not necessarily what the defendant told the officers, but what he left out and what he told them. Now, this is a copy of the statement that he signed that day when he met with the officers. He remembers well that prior to Christmas, he had been in Spokane. Now, this would have been a month earlier by now. The interview's on the 12th of January. This meeting was the 13th of December. And he says, I remember going to Spokane, but if you'll notice what he leaves out, he just says, I met Marita at a hotel. We then traveled to Wenatchee, and I spent 2 nights. Now, what's missing there? First of all, he stays the night at the hotel. He ignores all of that information about what he and Marita was doing, what he was trying to get Marita to do. But more importantly, if he had told them that he rented the hotel room in Spokane, it wouldn't make any sense why Marita Messick had to rent a hotel for him in Wenatchee. But even more important, no mention of Moses Lake. No mention that 2 weeks before the murder, he was within a few miles of Sage Munro, or what he was doing there. In his version of the events, he told the police, he leaves it out altogether. We went from Spokane to Wenatchee. He also mentions that after that, he talks about going and getting some cars. But then he also says that, actually maybe this was on the previous slide. He says that after several times when Rita came to Montana, he remembers that. And he says that she left after being there for Christmas break. And that he then went to Pocatello and paid for a couple of cars. He talks about specifically the cars he left. I left my Subaru and one Honda in a Wells Fargo parking lot. He remembers all that. But then what he says is he brings up Rex Lane. Is after that, after leaving the car, I then went to Wyoming and visited Rex. He crosses out, returned to Helena. Not sure why. Not sure why he didn't want to talk about the time he was in Helena when he was at Samantha Costigan's house. But he crosses that out and then says, I then went to Longmont, Colorado to celebrate the New Year's. The problem, of course, with this story is it shows that he's trying to say he went to be with Rex Lane and then went to Colorado. So he even called Rex Lane on the cell phone. Hey Rex, wasn't I with you? 28th and 29th of December. No. You left prior to Christmas. Well, now what's he going to do? The defendant changes it, and he says down below, oh yeah, the day that Marita called me and asked me, where are you? I was in Great Falls, Montana. So he's saying he remembers the call, and he remembers where he was. But when officers ask him for any kind of specific, who did you see? Where did you go? What did you do? Where did you stay? Who did you stay with? He's got nothing. Because he had just based his whole alibi on Rex Lane. And Rex Lane wasn't biting. In fact, as you heard from Rex Lane, the last time the defendant had been there was prior to Christmas, when the defendant was told if he was going to sell him a car, apparently at a good deal. And on the 29th of December, Rex Lane was trying to contact with the defendant to get the car, and the defendant never showed. Rex Lane still had the duffel bag at his house that the defendant had left there. Now, Miller's Crossing doesn't actually come next. It comes before this. It comes before the meeting with the police. This is 3 days earlier, before detectives have ever contacted David Nichols, before detectives have contacted David Nichols' friends, and only a few days after the defendant returns from Colorado, he goes to Miller's Crossing bar hopping. And by all accounts, he's in high spirits. He's celebrating. He's buying shots of Washington apples, not just for himself, for the girls at the table behind him, for Michelle Herb, who was waiting at the bar for a friend, for Eric Allsager when she sat down, or for when he sat down, and even for himself. And after a few drinks, the defendant was ready to talk. He told Eric Allsager, and this is a pretty interesting way to start a conversation, I'm being investigated for murder. Never mind that no one had told him that. The only thing he had heard from was Marita Messick, who was accusing him. That was it. So when Eric Allsager asked what it's about, he says, I went to Washington and shot a guy in the chest. He didn't see it coming. And the reason I did it was because he was dating Marita. Allsager called and told a couple of his friends about this meeting. But as he told you, he didn't think much of it because what a crazy story. I mean, he hadn't heard anything about the homicide. He hadn't read about it online. He hadn't talked to Marita in years. But when Marita Messick called Paul York, who had heard about this from Mr. Allsager, and then Marita called him, he realized what was going on. And he met with law enforcement and told them. And ask yourself, what is Eric Allsager's motivation for testifying in this trial? And look at the detail. No, it's not as specific as it could have been. But how does someone know that Sage was shot in the chest? Maybe he read it somewhere, maybe Marita has said it, even though Marita told you she didn't know any of the information. Let's assume. What about that second part? He didn't see it coming. How could he or would he say something like that unless he knew, because he was the one that pulled the trigger? Ladies and gentlemen, the defendant confessed to Eric Allsager. He was bragging, he was drinking, he was celebrating. Just those few days after getting back from Colorado in Montana, he's celebrating with shots of Washington apples, buying them for whoever wanted them from him, bragging about killing Marita Messick's boyfriend. Fortunately for him, 3 days later, he met with the police. And the police at that point, as we've already talked about, didn't have his phone records showing where he'd gone to and from. Now what's also interesting is much later, in June of 2010, they secured the defendant's phone, and later a phone dump was performed. Now a phone dump is a little bit different than a computer forensic evaluation. Sometimes computers, they'll actually go back and dig up stuff that was actually deleted. This phone dump only contained what the defendant had on his phone 6 months after the murder. So anything that he had kept on there would be there. Anything he hadn't would not. Now these are just examples, and you can't see them, I'm sorry. You would be able to see them on admitted evidence. But you can see that he kept a number of the text messages from Marita, which is designated by the name Baby Mama, all the way down, as well as other text messages from other people are on here. These are just some examples from, I believe it's September of 2009. And here on the top, and again there's a lot of pages in between that I'm not showing you for now, but you can take a look at them. You can even see some of those text messages from December 23rd, when she left without saying goodbye. And then all of a sudden, there is one message on the 28th of December from apparently someone named Daniel, and then there's nothing. The next text message that he kept on his phone was from January 4th, 2010. And when you look back through his phone records, you can see that he kept a number of text messages after this point. But for whatever reason, all the text messages between December 28th and January 4th are gone from his phone. Now, maybe he didn't get any text messages. Well, we know that's not true. We know for sure that Samantha Costigan texted him on the night of the 28th and said, "In Great Falls, you suck." It's not on there. Also, the conversations back and forth with Rex Lane about the car, not there. He kept ones before, he kept ones after, but during the time of the homicide, immediately after, they are gone. Now, we already sort of did this in opening. I want you to know you're not going to see any naked pictures this time. These are just some of the pictures the defendant had kept on her phone. The defendant kept on his phone, even 6 months after the homicide, he kept photographs of Marita Messick, even though she had made it perfectly clear to him that it was over. Perfectly clear that they were not going to be together months later, and she is still all over his phone, along with a lot of the text messages she had sent him. Now, as you know, while law enforcement was investigating this case, they sent the handcuffs to the crime lab. And at the crime lab, Anna Wilson found a mixed DNA profile of 3 or possibly more people. And what the mixed profile means is that there's DNA of these 3 people, but it's so mixed together that you can't pull them apart and distinguish 3 individual DNA strands. Law enforcement sent a number of different exclusionary DNA to compare against the handcuffs, including Ian Libby. And every single one of them was excluded from the DNA, except for the defendant, David Nichols. When she described it on the stand, she referred to the DNA comparisons as numbers. I don't know that that's actually the technical term, but I'll admit it's a lot easier for me to understand. All of his numbers, his entire profile, all of those numbers are in the mixture from the handcuffs, so he's included as a contributor to that mixture. Now, what does that mean? The defense, when they questioned Anna Wilson on the stand, tried to downplay the significance of the DNA by using the analogy of phone numbers put into a hat. Under that example, they would take three people, person A, B, and C. They take the individual numbers from their phone numbers and toss all those individual little numbers into a hat. So under this example, you'd have the numbers 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, and 9. So,
3 is not there, counsel.
thank you, Judge. No 3. So under this example, if someone had a phone number with a 3 in it, they could be excluded as being a contributor because there's no 3 in the hat. But someone, if David Nichols, if he has a 7 in his phone number, well, he can't be excluded because he has a 7 and there's a 7 somewhere in the hat. Doesn't sound like that good of evidence, does it? Not something really to consider. The only problem with the analogy is it's completely wrong. As Anna Wilson testified, when they take DNA, they look at 13 distinctive points on the DNA strand in order. Each one of those points has a number much greater than 0 to 9. For this analogy, we're simply going to use 0 to 99, though it could be much higher. At each point, there would be a mixture of 3 numbers, one from each contributor. We don't know, for example, on this first point with 17, 64, 87, we don't know which one goes to A, which one goes to B, and which one goes to C. We only know that they're there. When they took the defendant's DNA and compared it, in order, every single one of his numbers matched all the way down the line. And that's why she was able to say the defendant's DNA is included in the mixed DNA profile. 13 points, a mixture of 3, possibly more individuals, and his number is there every time in the right order. Ladies and gentlemen, the defendant's DNA was on those handcuffs. On handcuffs that he had no business having there with his DNA in Sage Munro's yard. Ladies and gentlemen, when you consider the defendant's obsession for Marita Messick, when you consider what he said to Zeb Barber, or about Zeb Barber, when you consider that he told Marita Messick that I will hurt the ones you love if you don't stay in contact with me, when you hear about the times he would go to Ephrata or call her on the phone or is outside watching her and Sage, when you hear about the proposition to Mr. Lane 30 days before the murder, will you kill someone for me? When you hear about him going to Spokane, lying to police about not being in Moses Lake, having Marita rent a hotel room in her name. When you hear the testimony that when she leaves without saying goodbye, within 2 hours he's looking for a gun, 5 or 6 days before the murder. When you see that on the night before the murder he's driving to Washington and the next day he's driving out and going to Colorado. When you hear that he's bragging in a bar just after he gets back about how he murdered Marita Messick's boyfriend, and when his DNA is found at the scene, ladies and gentlemen, here's your murderer. The defendant, David Nichols, murdered Sage Munro. He is guilty of murder in the first degree. If you were hoping I was done, I'm not. Because we still have to talk now about Ian Libby. Ian Libby. As you've heard throughout this trial, and actually, can we have all the lights on, please? Mr. Bailey? Thank you, Chief Deputy. As you've heard throughout this trial, law enforcement conducted a thorough initial investigation, followed by a defense investigation, followed by another thorough law enforcement follow-up investigation into Ian Libby. Throughout this entire case, throughout all the investigation, 2 names have been presented to you: David Nichols and Ian Libby. Now, the state bears the burden of proving that David Nichols committed the murder. But there's also no question in your mind that the defense is alleging that Ian Libby did it. As you may recall from opening statements a long time ago, when Mr. Larinaga got up here, he told you that the evidence would show Ian Libby, Julian Latimer, and some third guy, presumably Brenza Mills, were prowling Sage Munro's trucks with guns. When Sage Munro came out, startled them, and Ian Libby shot him. It's a great story. The only problem with it, there's no evidence. There is zero evidence, zero, that those three individuals were out prowling the truck. Nothing. There is zero evidence that Sage Munro even kept guns in his truck, other than occasionally for hunting. And even then, there's no evidence that he would keep them in there overnight. There's no evidence that Ian Libby, Julian Latimer, and Brenza Mills were planning in advance to break into the truck. There was nothing after the fact, evidence to support they had broken into the truck before. Nothing. It'll be interesting to see, now that the evidence is in, or the lack of evidence is in, if the defense is still going to make this claim. So what do they have? They have Crystal Tixon. That's their star witness. Crystal Tixon claims that she woke up on the morning of December 29th, 2009 to text messages from Ian Libby saying that there was emergency, he needed to get out of the area, where are you, something bad's happened. You may recall that when she first was on the stand and being asked by the defense, she said that those text messages started in the middle of the night. She never talked about one set of text messages starting in the middle of the night and then the emergency text messages coming later. She started off by saying they came in the middle of the night. Then she went out in the hall during the break, had a conversation with the defense about text messages, that they were going to revisit that, and then the first time on the stand back, she nailed it. Those text messages about the emergency, they came in the early morning. Why is that significant? Because clearly if the text messages came in the middle of the night, they weren't about a murder. Murder happened at 6:30. If these text messages from Ian Libby are talking about an emergency at 12 or 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6, they have nothing to do with Sage Munro's death. That's only the first problem with the text messages. The second, Ian Libby's actions the morning of the homicide were completely inconsistent with text messages saying that he was paranoid, freaked out, wanting to get out of the area, help me, emergency, gotta get away. Now, Ms. Tixon stated that she woke up when her kids got up, and that her kids are early risers, which was sometime between 7 or 8:30. Wish I had those kids. But let's say it's 8:30. Let's say that all of the text messages were sent right at 8:30, which of course doesn't make any sense, but let's just say that. That means that they're being sent even though at 7:30, Ian Libby is at the scene. As Officer Powell testified, as Brianna Crump testified, as Julian Latimer testified, Ian Libby shows up pounding on the window. Now that might have been a little bit later, but we know from Officer Powell that around 7:30, he is at the scene, as Officer Powell called it, rubbernecking, trying to find out what's going on, looking to see what happened. This is big news. These are news crews and police cars and ambulances on the street. It's taped off, and he's out looking around the scene. Is that even remotely consistent with text messages that he's terrified and is trying to get out of the area? Now, the next piece from Crystal Tixon is the foggy ride. Initially on the stand, she testified with certainty the foggy ride was the night of December 29th, 2009. She then had to admit that in the statement that she wrote or signed for the defense, she had actually crossed that out and said, or 1 or 2 days later. And even though Ian Libby had not mentioned in the text messages that he wanted to get rid of something, apparently the night of the 29th or the 30th or the 31st, now he's wanting to get rid of something. The defense would have you infer that's your murder weapon. only problem with that theory. There's been no mention at all that he ever said it was the murder weapon or it was the gun in the text messages or in person. When he came to the vehicle, he didn't have a gun in his hands. He didn't have anything wrapped in his hands. He didn't have a bulge in his shirt or pants that resembled a gun. And while they're in the car only 2 feet away for half an hour, Crystal Tixon does not see or hear about any gun. Now again, this is Ian Libby terrified out of his mind because he's just killed Sage Munro, and they're driving down to get rid of the gun in the well. Except when it got too foggy and Crystal Tixon had to turn around, her response, or his response, that's okay, we'll do it later. You remember Crystal Tixon said Ian Libby acting like this was normal. Ian Libby acting like something big was going on, something scary was going on, perfectly normal for him. And on the whole drive there, they're not even talking about the homicide. They're talking about their relationship. On the drive back, they're not talking about it. When she initially meets with law enforcement, she says they weren't even talking about it at all. But on the stand, it was apparently right at the end as he's getting out of the car, she mentions something about the homicide, and as she put it, he didn't deny it. Whatever that means. Does that mean he didn't answer her? Does that mean he said, I don't know, whatever that means, that he didn't deny it? And that at that point he said something about he, Julian, and a gang guy. There's your entire evidence of those 3 people. That statement from Crystal Tixon, who never told police or anyone else that Ian Libby made that statement until after she was beaten up by him 3 weeks later. The only testimony that we have that she was telling anything about Ian Libby was to Laura Hayes, who we'll talk about later, and all of her inconsistencies in her story. But even then, when she talked to Laura Hayes, all she said was, Ian killed Sage. Never mind that she admitted on the stand that Ian Libby never said Sage's name, never mentioned E Street, any of that. Now, we need to talk briefly about Julian Latimer before getting back to Crystal Tixon. And that is, what evidence do we have then? What evidence do we have to support this statement by Crystal Tixon that Ian Libby mentioned Julian and Ian, and Bridson Mills? Julian Latimer, Rihanna Crump, Nan Latimer all testified Julian was home that night, in bed. They even gave the details about how Ian came up to the window and knocked to try to get him to come outside, and that they were acting perfectly normal. Now maybe the defense would say, well, maybe you shouldn't believe Nan Latimer on this point, or Julian. But what about Rihanna Crump? A former girlfriend who doesn't even live in the state, doesn't have anything to do with him anymore. What is her motivation to get up on the stand and to say that? And of course the defense wants to have it both ways, because they introduced testimony that Nan Latimer heard the phone ringing 50 times. I ask you really if that's an accurate number, if someone was calling your house 50 times in the middle of the night, you just keep letting it ring. But he's calling sometime after 6:30 in the morning, not exactly sure when, and why would Ian Libby be calling Julian over and over if they're out together? You can't have it both ways. If those phone calls happened, that's because Julian Latimer was there in the house. The only person who testified contrary that Julian Latimer might not have been in the house was Miss Lynch, who admitted on the stand she didn't know what time she went to sleep, that she went to sleep in the back part of the house on the couch, that she woke up at 7:30 when Julian Latimer came in through the back after going and looking at the scene, and that she wouldn't have heard him necessarily come in or exit through the front door. She also admitted that Rihanna Crump, the girlfriend, lived in town with her parents, and that her recollection was any time she was over there staying the night was because Julian Latimer was there. That was it. The only evidence you had that Julian might have been out that night was Lynch, who doesn't remember him being there, but saw him in the morning talking about the scene again, perfectly normal. He even goes back out again to see more of it. There's no evidence about the third guy. So there's nothing to talk about this third person who's involved. There's just nothing there at all. Now back to Crystal Tyson. Her testimony on the stand, consistent with the signed, typed declaration 2 years after the fact, was that after she was assaulted on the 21st of January 2010, while they were driving and dropping off Ian Libby back behind his brother-in-law's house, or brother's house, that Ian Libby got out of the car and said in a loud, firm, easily to hear voice, "I'm gonna kill you like I killed that guy." The only problem with that testimony, it's completely unsupported. There is no question that Ian Libby assaulted Crystal Tyson that day. None at all. He was prosecuted in this county, pled guilty, and Crystal Tyson was unsatisfied with the amount of time he got.
Objection, facts not in evidence.
One moment.
I'll be happy to just withdraw that if I can. Remember, I asked the question.
The objection is sustained. The jury should disregard the last comment as not consistent with or not supported by any evidence.
Crystal Tyxon's story cannot be believed because of her exaggerations, her half-truths, and her all-out lies. Remember that on the day of the assault, the same day, she filled out a written statement that she did herself. Law enforcement wasn't even there. And then her story on the stand was different 2 years later. You can see that all of the exaggerations in her story are used to make a more interesting, more compelling story against Ian Libby. The first, most glaring, obvious untruth in her initial statement was that she drove her own car to the caves that day. Her reason for lying about the car is unclear. Something about how she wasn't supposed to be with Mr. Libby, and so somehow, because she was in her own car as opposed to driving there with him, that made a difference. Not sure what that means, but either way, her own car. The story that she gave on the stand with the defense was that she was on for a nice hike up the hill with Ian Libby, and then she came, and Jimmy Morrison, and that when she came back down with Mr. Libby, that's when he started assaulted her all the way down the hill. The assault continued, but this is where it differs from her statement. She says that as she's being assaulted by Jimmy Morrison's truck, she makes a break for it for her car. A little more compelling story, Crystal Tyson fleeing for her life. That Ian Libby chases her down to the car, throws her against it, punches her against it, slams her head into the door, and then, as she's lying on the ground, while kicking her in the head, says, "I'm gonna kill you like I killed that guy." After that, he gets in his truck and drives circles around her while kicking up gravel, and Crystal Tyson sees this as her chance to escape, gets in her car, and drives away. Only problem with that story, it's not true. What a compelling, powerful story. Ian Libby, the man who just weeks earlier had insinuated that he was involved in a murder, is kicking her in the head while saying, "I'm gonna kill you like I killed that guy." and Crystal Tixon fleeing for her life in her car. It's a lot more compelling than her getting back in the truck with Ian Libby. And of course, Crystal Tixon had to admit on the stand, well, that actually didn't happen that way. There's no way that Ian Libby was kicking her in the head when he made this statement, because the statement was made as he's getting out of the truck back after Jimmy Morrison drops him off. That's the new story. So why did she make up this earlier story? Because she's furious at Ian Libby. She's furious that he beat her up. The defense tried to paint this terrified Crystal Tixon. This story that Laura Hayes tells us, that Crystal Tixon, on December 29th, covered in blood and badly beaten up, even though Crystal Tixon didn't testify to that, jumps and monkey hugs her, I think is the term, wraps her legs and arms around Laura Hayes, says, Ian killed Sage. Ian Libby, the murderer, she's terrified of him, and yet 3 weeks later, she's up in the caves alone with him having sex. And as they're coming down the hill, Ian Libby proposes, and what's her response? She laughs at him. I'm not going to be with a guy like you. All I want you for is sex. Is that consistent with the terrified Crystal Tixon who believes Ian Libby's a murderer? Never mind that she never told anybody about it till after the assault. Gave any of these details. So now she adds this new piece. No, he didn't say that to me earlier at the caves. He said it when he was getting out of the truck in a loud, clear voice. Only problem? Jimmy Morrison didn't hear it. The defense tried to paint Mr. Morrison as a man with a drug problem who therefore couldn't remember certain things and therefore must have forgot. Only problem with that, he had no problem remembering the trip to the caves. No problem remembering that he drove the truck. No problem remembering that he came down the hill while the other two stayed up there. No problem remembering that Ian Libby assaulted Crystal Tixon outside the truck. No problem remembering the drive back and the assault in the car. No problem remembering where he went and dropped off Ian Libby that day, back in the alley behind his brother's house. No problem remembering that after that, he took Crystal to his house to get her some ice and take care of her with his mother. But those drugs must have affected his memory when he did not hear Ian Libby make that statement. It's because it never happened. Yes, Ian Libby assaulted Crystal Tixon. He didn't make that statement, though. That was Crystal Tixon adding in details to get Ian Libby in trouble. Despite all the lies, all the exaggerations, the defense still wants you to believe that Mr. Libby made that threatened confession. Never mind all the other stuff we already know wasn't true about Crystal Tixon's story. That part must be true because that is really the only real confession, even though he doesn't mention Sage in this case. The other one they try to point to is Nan Latimer. Let's take Nan Latimer's story at face value. Nan Latimer doesn't like Ian Libby, doesn't like her son being around Mr. Libby. Mr. Libby knows Nan Latimer doesn't like him. And what the defense wants you to believe is that 2 days or so after the homicide, when Nan Latimer essentially points her finger at Mr. Libby and said, Ian, you better not have been involved in that murder. And he goes, I did it, ha ha ha. That's a confession. Ladies and gentlemen, that's Ian Libby being a moron. It wasn't funny, but it wasn't a confession. He sure didn't confess to his friends that you also heard from the defense's case, like Matt Cox or Julian Latimer, but supposedly he confesses to Nan Latimer in a semi-public setting right after the homicide, a woman that he knows doesn't like him? Of course not. He probably did say it. It just wasn't a confession. He was being stupid. So, with that out of the way, what do you got? What evidence is there that Ian Libby, Julian Latimer, some third guy, were prowling Sage's truck for guns when they startled Sage and Ian shot him? You have nothing. First, and I'm actually close to wrapping up. First, no evidence that there's guns in the truck. Second, no evidence they were prowling for guns that night. Third, no evidence that they're together. We haven't even talked about calling Gibbons. Colleen Gibbons is sitting with her window facing the truck. She doesn't hear voices. She doesn't hear the truck open and close. After the shot, she certainly doesn't see 3 people by the truck. After the shot, she doesn't hear people yelling, "Go, get out of here." I mean, this wasn't a planned thing. Certainly doesn't see 3 people involved in breaking into a truck while she's sitting there eating and then afterwards. Makes it sound like whoever shot Sage did it when Sage didn't even know it was coming. There's even more. Snow on the windowsill. You can see in the pictures. As anyone who's lived in Grant County well knows, when you have snow on your windowsill, on your door, you open and close the door, the snow falls. It's uneven. Perfectly even line of snow still on the windows of Sage's truck. How about fingerprints? Nope. Fingerprints were tested against Latimer and Libby, negative. DNA? Nope. Ian Libby's excluded from the handcuffs. And what about the handcuffs? If Ian Libby, Julian Latimer, and Brenza Mills are involved, there would be handcuffs over there, outside of Colleen Gibbons' view, because they're prowling the truck. No reason for them to be over there. How about the bullet casing? South side of the lawn, over by the tree where there's no snow. No reason for that to be there if they're over there prowling the truck. But what about the anonymous tip? Remember about that in opening? In opening, you heard about the anonymous tipster. Someone called in saying that Ian Libby was the guy, and the officers didn't follow up on it. The officers admitted that was a mistake. No question. It was a mistake they didn't get the 911 call. But of course, you heard Colleen Gibbons testify. She was the one that made the 911 call, and now you've heard from the anonymous tipster. What firsthand information did she have that Ian Libby was involved in this murder? Nothing. She wasn't there. She didn't hear a confession. Nothing. Her entire statement rests on 3 words by Crystal Tixon: Ian killed Sage. Never mind the weird story about the blood on the shirt and it looking like she'd just been beaten up on the night of December 29th, which there's no evidence that that ever happened from Crystal Tixon. She had no firsthand information. This entire case rested against Mr. Libby, rested on Crystal Tixon's bogus story. You have nothing to support it. How about Mr. Libby's attitude? Curious, normal, looking around the scene, certainly not hiding. What about days or weeks or months later? You remember Matt Cox's testimony? It was in 2011. Ian Libby contacted him and said, "Hey, have investigators been by to see you?" And he's crying and he says, "I don't want to go to prison." Sounds like an admission until he finishes the sentence. "For something I didn't do. I do not want to go to prison for something I didn't do." The defense raised this case on Ian Libby. You heard about the thorough investigation they did, asking people, taking statements to them to sign against Ian Libby. He was scared and he was mad. You heard him threatening, if that was the word, the snitches, the people who are out talking to these investigators, saying that he's involved in the case, because he wasn't. The defense is trying to pin a murder on Ian Libby and David Nichols.
Objection, burden shifting. The defense, there's no burden of proof whatsoever presenting any evidence.
The objection is sustained. Statement of defendants, the defense attempting to pin the murder is stricken. The jury should disregard it.
Yeah, and let me clarify that, and I believe I've said it before. The state bears the burden of proof in this case. The state has to bear the burden that David Nichols killed Sage Munro. The defense has argued that Ian Libby was the person who did it, and there's no evidence to support it. If I could have that second light off again, please. Let's look just briefly at the comparison between the two, and then we'll wrap up. Who had the motive? David Nichols' motivation was Marita Messick. What was Ian Libby's motivation? Again, no evidence about the guns or the truck or anything. Certainly not to murder Sage Munro. How about means? David Nichols, 5 days before the homicide, looking for a gun. How about opportunity? Got to give Ian Libby that one. He does live in Ephrata. The defendant traveled from Washington or to Washington the day before, the night before, and left the next day. Preparation and intent, again, you bet. We could talk again about the, for lack of a better word, stalking outside of the home in November, the conversation with Rex Lane asking to kill someone, the getting of the gun. All of that shows his preparation intent. Ian Libby's preparation intent to commit the robbery of the truck or to kill Sage Munro? Nothing. How about scene consistency? One set of footprints going around the back of the house, not three. The snow still on the window sill. The handcuffs over on the side, out of view from what Colleen Gibbons would have seen. Not Ian Libby. That only supports David Nichols. How about the aftermath? Ian Libby's hanging out in the area looking at the scene. The defendant is long gone. Ian Libby's looking around to try and see what's going on. The defendant lies about where he is. Says he's in Great Falls. Now I want to talk about the false alibi for a minute, so I'm actually going to zoom ahead. We covered this at the very end of the case. This is an interview the detectives did with David Nichols 6 months after the murder. And they asked him about the alibi he says he has, that he's in Great Falls. So they asked him, all right, you filled up. December 28th, day before the homicide, you filled up over here at the Zip Trip, right before you left town, pump number 4. The Cynic station, let's start there. Now this is in the Helen area. Defendant, I got gas. All right? And where'd you go? On a drive. Where? Where's that drive to? I don't know. Come on. I always get gas. I gotta get gas every day almost. Tell us about your trip after you left Helena. I drove, I don't know. So where did you drive to? Down the road, I don't know. Where'd you go after you fueled up? On drive, I don't know. Did you have a purpose for that drive, or did you just go for a drive? It was a nice day. ... I think. Almost made a mistake there. Because of course, if you remember how nice the day was, you probably remember where you were and where you were going. Never mind that it sounds like for most of the testimony we've heard it was snowy and not the best of conditions. But for a moment, it was a nice day, I think. So where did you end up? I don't know. Why is it that on the 29th of December at about 8 o'clock in the morning, when Marita called you, you told her you were in Great Falls? Maybe I was in Great Falls. Why were you in Washington? I never said I was in Washington. That was the conversation that the defendant had. And again, this is the second one that he has with law enforcement about what he was doing on the 28th and 29th of December. No longer, of course, is there any mention of Rex Lane because that alibi had already fallen through. DNA? Yep. There is for David Nichols, not for Ian Libby. He's excluded. How about a confession? Again, that's for you to decide what value, if any, you want to give to Ian Libby's confession to Crystal Tixon and to Nan Latimer. Ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, when Messick stopped sleeping with the defendant because she was with Sage, when she turned down the defendant's offer in Spokane because of Sage, when she turned her head and wouldn't let the defendant kiss her in Montana before she left because of Sage, when she left without saying goodbye because she was going to be with Sage, the defendant decided that same night that he was going to kill Sage Munro. And he was looking for a gun. Now it's true, this wasn't the first time he thought about it. 30 days earlier, he had asked Rex Lane if he would kill someone and had been in the Ephrata area looking at Sage Munro's house. The reason why the defendant killed Sage Munro is because Marita Messick loved Sage Munro. So he went there in the morning, shot him in the chest. As the defendant described it later, bragging in a bar. Sage never even saw it coming. His DNA is at the scene. He is the one that confessed. He is the one with the motive, the means, and the opportunity to have murdered Sage Munro. And ladies and gentlemen, he is guilty of murder in the first degree. Thank you.